At 17 minutes past 8 in the evening, the executive floor air conditioning shut down. That left me alone in the engineering bay after a 14-hour shift, listening to the humming server fans. Through the thin glass of the boardroom, I heard the chairman casually schedule my termination for Friday afternoon. They thought they were quietly removing a stubborn tech employee. They had no idea I was the only reason those servers never truly belonged to them. My name is Aria Crawford. The executive floor air conditioning had just shut down with a heavy mechanical sigh. The sudden absence of rushing air left a hollow vacuum in the engineering bay, filling the expansive space instead with the relentless, droning hum of the server racks. I was sitting alone under the harsh, cold, white fluorescent lights, rubbing my exhausted eyes after grinding through almost 14 hours of continuous work. The massive office building was entirely hollowed out, stripped of the daytime corporate buzz. It left behind only the mechanical heartbeat of the data center I had built from the ground up. I reached for my forgotten, ice-cold cup of coffee, intending to finally pack up my things, when a flicker of movement caught my peripheral vision. The towering glass walls of the main executive boardroom were meant to symbolize modern corporate transparency, a brilliant architectural lie. Through that thin, soundproofed pane, the high-end recessed lights were still blazing. Inside sat Chairman Gideon Vale, Chief Financial Officer Preston Hale, and Human Resources Director Vera Sloan. They looked entirely relaxed, silk ties loosened, leaning back in their ridiculously expensive leather chairs. I could see the sharp, angular movements of their hands as they talked. And because the ventilation shafts connecting our spaces carried sound far better than they carried air when the main system was powered off, I could hear every single word dropping directly through the ceiling grate above my desk. "We terminate her on Friday afternoon," Gideon said. His voice was incredibly smooth, carrying the practiced, sterile cadence of a man who fired people the very same way he ordered a dry martini at a country club. Vera nodded diligently, jotting something down on her sleek leather notepad. "Standard severance package. Or do we offer a slight bump in pay to ensure she signs the non-disclosure agreement quickly and quietly?" "Just the standard package." Preston scoffed, rolling his eyes. He leaned forward, resting his tailored elbows on the table. "She is not going to put up a fight. She does not have the financial leverage to drag us into litigation. We just need her out before the weekend begins." I froze in my chair, my hand hovering mere inches from my laptop lid. My pulse did not spike, my breath did not catch. Instead, a deep, glacial calm washed over me, chilling the blood in my veins. They were talking about me. They were casually scheduling my professional execution as if they were discussing swapping out a defective light bulb in the hallway. The sheer indignity of it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, but I forced the humiliation deep down, compressing it into something hard and dense. "Are we absolutely certain Soren Pike is up to speed?" Gideon asked, tapping an expensive silver pen against his palm. "We cannot afford any technical downtime." "Not right now." "Soren is perfectly capable," Preston replied with a highly dismissive wave of his hand. "He has been shadowing her for 3 solid weeks. The girl is a glorified mechanic. She built the engine, sure, but she does not know how to drive the car. Pike knows enough to keep the lights on and, more importantly, he knows how to follow instructions without asking so many damn questions." The insult stung, a sharp, invisible slap of humiliation, but I swallowed it down instantly. I pressed my back tightly against the mesh fabric of my chair, remaining completely still, letting the deep shadows of the tech bay hide my presence. Soren Pike was a consultant who barely understood basic network topology. The fact that they thought he could replace me showed exactly how little they understood the digital empire they claimed to rule. "She asked for a 30% raise last quarter," Vera chimed in, a cruel, mocking smile tugging at the corner of her perfectly painted lips. "Claimed she was doing the work of 3 senior architects. These tech types, they really only know servers. They have absolutely no concept of internal politics or actual corporate value. Well, her utter lack of political instinct is exactly why she has to go," Gideon stated, his tone darkening slightly as the humor left his face. He dropped the silver pen onto the table with a sharp clatter. She got entirely too close to the disaster remediation pipelines. The post-hurricane emergency funds are highly sensitive. We cannot have a mid-level engineer poking around the secondary data streams looking for anomalies she simply does not understand. The words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach, locking all the scattered puzzle pieces of the last 2 months into a terrifying, perfectly clear picture. The hurricane relief funds, the massive, urgent payouts to unknown contractors with barely any digital footprint, the strange, convoluted data routing that deliberately bypassed my primary security protocols. I had flagged those transactions as critical system errors. I had assumed it was a dangerous glitch in the shadow servers. I had reported it 3 separate times, strictly following the established compliance protocols. Every single time, they had brushed me off with condescending smiles, telling me it was merely a temporary liquidity optimization phase. Now, I understood the grim reality. It was not a glitch. It was a feature. A feature they deliberately built to siphon money, and one I had accidentally stumbled over while trying to keep their network secure. "We are closing the massive refinancing round on Monday morning," Preston reminded them, his voice tight with raw anticipation and underlying greed. "The lenders will be initiating their final infrastructure audit over the weekend. If Crawford is still on the system, her automated compliance triggers will flag the shadow ledgers immediately. The bank will see the dual routing. The entire deal will die before lunch, which is exactly why she will be gone on Friday," Gideon finalized. He leaned back again, looking incredibly pleased with his own ruthless efficiency. Then, Preston said the phrase that changed the color of the entire room, turning the sterile white light into something suffocating. It was not the firing that tipped the scale. It was the frantic instruction that followed. "Make sure we lock her access before she hits the elevator," Preston instructed Vera, his eyes narrowing with genuine paranoia. "Do not let her touch a keyboard or a mobile device after you hand her the termination paperwork. Sever every single credential immediately." That was it. That was the ultimate tell. You do not treat a clueless, glorified mechanic like a live bomb about to go off. You treat a lethal threat that way. They were terrified of me. They were absolutely terrified of the access I held, the master keys I carried, and the vast digital kingdom I governed from the shadows. They needed to push me out the door before the lenders arrived, because they knew I was the only person in the entire building who knew exactly where the digital bodies were buried. I sat there in the dim, freezing light of the engineering bay. Anger is a hot, messy, unpredictable emotion. It makes you reckless. It makes you storm into boardrooms, scream about fairness, demand transparent answers, or smash expensive keyboards. I felt absolutely none of that. I felt a terrifying, absolute clarity settling over my mind like a fresh layer of winter ice. I did not bang my fists on the glass. I did not pull out my phone to record their incriminating conversation. I did not indulge in any dramatic, useless gestures. The air moving through my lungs was perfectly steady. The rhythmic hum of the servers wrapped around me, a familiar, comforting language that Gideon, Preston, and Vera would never, ever understand. They truly thought they were the ultimate architects of this company, simply because they wore the expensive tailored suits and signed the massive payroll checks. They fundamentally misunderstood the true nature of the modern corporate world. They thought the building belonged to them because their names were proudly displayed on the lease. They did not realize that the physical building was just an empty shell. The real company, the beating heart, the memories, the sins, the stolen funds, the deep secrets they all lived down in the sub-basement server room. And I was the one who drew the master map. I slowly reached out and quietly closed my laptop. The soft, solitary click of the latch was instantly swallowed by the ambient noise of the heavy cooling fans. I turned my head, looking past the glass wall, down through the solid floorboards in my mind's eye, straight into the dark, humming belly of the secondary server clusters. If they had just fired me for standard budget cuts, I would have walked away with my head held high. I would have handed over the administrative passwords, updated my resume, and found a tech company that actually respected my worth. But they had chosen to completely betray me to cover up their own massive, systemic fraud. They were planning to discard me to protect a multi-million-dollar lie, right at the exact moment I had seen entirely too much. I stood up smoothly, sliding my heavy laptop into my dark messenger bag. I did not need to launch a fiery cyber attack. I did not need to deploy malicious ransomware code, wipe their corporate hard drives, or burn the entire network to the ground. Doing any of that would only prove them right. It would immediately make me the unstable, disgruntled, rogue employee they were already eagerly writing me off to be. They relied heavily on my complex architecture to keep the company running smoothly, but they also desperately relied on my architecture to keep their dirty secrets perfectly hidden. The secure digital partitions, the heavily encrypted routing, the executive-level blind spots I had built, all of those intricate features to protect the company from vicious external threats. I had been blindly shielding them for years without even knowing what I was shielding. I walked slowly toward the exit, my footsteps completely silent on the thick carpeted floor. I cast one last, long glance back at the brightly lit boardroom, watching the three of them lean back in smug satisfaction, already certain they had won. I made a silent, unbreakable vow right there in the dark. I am not going to destroy a single thing. I am just going to stop hiding the truth for them. Come Friday afternoon, they will take my physical badge, but by Monday morning, the entire system will speak for itself. I am 35 years old, and I did not arrive in this towering glass sanctuary by accident. I was raised in Toledo, Ohio, the only daughter in a fiercely straightforward working-class family where you earned every single dollar through exhausting, manual labor. My parents did not understand the invisible, complex world of software architecture, but they understood grit. I did not have the luxury of a wealthy family or a safety net. I paid my way through a rigorous systems engineering and infrastructure security degree, relying entirely on academic scholarships, working late-night shifts in freezing computer labs, and driven by a bone-deep fear of failure. I entered the sprawling, unforgiving tech industry with the rigid, unyielding discipline of someone who knew there was absolutely no backup plan if I stumbled. 6 years ago, I walked through the sleek frosted glass doors of Stratodyne Asset Response for the first time. The company specialized in managing high-stakes emergency maintenance protocols for massive commercial real estate portfolios across the eastern seaboard. On the glossy brochures scattered across the marble lobby, they looked like a polished, modern enterprise capable of handling any catastrophic weather event. Underneath the hood, however, their digital infrastructure was an absolute nightmare. It was a fragile, tangled mess of outdated software architectures patched together from half a dozen sloppy corporate acquisitions. They had systems from the late 90s trying to shake hands with modern cloud servers, resulting in a daily operational panic that threatened to bring the entire business to its knees. They hired me to be a mid-level network mechanic, but out of sheer necessity, I became their supreme architect. Over several agonizingly long months, working 80-hour weeks while the executives slept soundly in their sprawling suburban mansions, I personally redesigned the entire server cluster from scratch. I stripped away the rotting legacy code. I implemented a highly robust multi-factor authentication protocol that firmly locked down our internal perimeters. I built a federated backup network that synced flawlessly across 3 geographically isolated data centers, ensuring that a physical disaster in one state would never erase our critical ledgers. Most importantly, I constructed a bulletproof reconciliation layer. That specific layer was a secure digital bridge connecting commercial building owners, massive global banks, and extremely risk-averse insurance firms into one unified, perfectly transparent dashboard. Once my architecture fully stabilized, the results were undeniable. Stratodyne began clearing complex, multi-million-dollar natural disaster claims exponentially faster than any major competitor in the market. The company revenue exploded, doubling and then tripling within a remarkably short period. And who proudly took the credit for this miraculous technological turnaround? The executive board. Naturally. They stood on brightly lit stages at lavish industry conferences in expensive tailored suits, boasting loudly to shareholders about their visionary leadership and agile business strategies. Meanwhile, my annual performance reviews always read the exact same infuriating way. Vera Sloan from Human Resources would sit across from me in her sterile office, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk while offering a patronizing, tight-lipped smile. The document would praise my excellent technical execution, but boldly state that I was severely lacking in executive presence. It was a cowardly, meaningless corporate phrase that simply meant I did not play their sycophantic office politics, and I did not laugh at their terrible jokes. I was the woman who had personally built the indestructible, beating spine of their entire digital empire, yet they comfortably paid me the salary of an elevated help desk receptionist. I knew exactly who these men were, long before I uncovered their darkest secrets. Gideon Vale, our esteemed chairman, was effortlessly polite and charismatic when a news microphone was in his face, but utterly ruthless the moment the boardroom doors clicked shut. He viewed employees strictly as disposable assets on a spreadsheet. Preston Hale, the chief financial officer, absolutely loved preaching about fiscal discipline and shared corporate sacrifice right before he systematically slashed the annual bonus pool for the entire engineering department to fund his executive retreats. And then there was Micah Dunn, the chief technology officer. Micah was a man who had not written a single line of viable code in over 10 years. He survived solely by aggressively stamping his authoritative signature on the exhausting, late-night labor of the actual technical team, nodding thoughtfully in meetings while silently praying nobody ever asked him to explain the actual mechanics of the network. The real, undeniable trouble began subtly over the past 2 years. While running routine, deep-level diagnostic sweeps during the quiet hours of the early morning, I started noticing strange anomalies scattered deeply across the disaster remediation pipelines. There were massive, urgent payout files attached to obscure, completely unknown contractor codes. I stared at my glowing monitors for hours, carefully tracing the hidden data flows. The invoice values were grotesquely inflated, completely out of sync with standard market rates for hurricane cleanup or severe flood damage repair. But the most alarming part was the digital routing itself. In any legitimate financial architecture, massive payouts must pass through the primary, heavily monitored compliance network, but these specific final approval signatures were deliberately bypassing my main security checkpoints. Instead, they were being quietly pushed through a secondary backup cluster, a hidden shadow cluster that, on paper, was strictly prohibited from processing live, permanent financial transactions. I did what any responsible, highly trained systems architect would do in that exact situation. I meticulously followed the firmly established corporate guidelines. I compiled the raw data logs, drafted the necessary compliance alerts, and officially reported the glaring anomalies 3 separate times over the course of 6 months. I did not run into their offices screaming wild accusations about fraud. I simply pointed out the critical architectural violations and the massive security risks they pose to our clients. Every single time, I was smoothly and firmly shut down. The responses I received were a masterclass in corporate evasion. Gideon smiled warmly during a brief hallway encounter and told me they were simply optimizing the liquidity flow to handle unexpected seasonal vendor demands. Preston sent a terse, poorly punctuated email warning me that we were in a highly sensitive phase right before a major refinancing event and that deep technical audits should be temporarily suspended. Finally, Micah pulled me aside in the break room, his eyes shifting nervously toward the security cameras, and explicitly told me not to dig too deeply into areas that fell completely outside my direct scope of work. That was the exact moment the cold, heavy dread truly set in deep within my chest. What terrified me was not the simple fact that the company was stealing money. Corporate greed is a painfully common, mundane reality of the modern business world. What kept me awake at night, staring blankly at the dark ceiling of my apartment, was the sheer, breathtaking audacity of their method. They were so incredibly confident, so utterly untouchable, that they had successfully woven their massive financial fraud directly into the permanent operational architecture of the company. It was not just a few rogue mid-level managers quietly skimming cash off the top of a spreadsheet. To build a system that corrupted the flow of money, and to route fake payments through shadow servers with that level of administrative clearance, you needed almost everyone on the top floor to have their hands in it. They thought they were incredibly smart. They thought they had successfully walled off their illicit activities behind thick layers of technical jargon, corporate bureaucracy, and untouchable executive privilege. But they forgot one fundamental, devastating truth about the complex digital world they so eagerly exploited. They forgot who actually built the walls. By then, I understood exactly what I was dealing with. This was no longer a workplace dispute or a quiet firing. It was a system built to protect fraud, and I was done helping them hide behind it. The investigation began quietly in the deep silence of the engineering bay. I started pulling the raw encrypted packet data from the archives, specifically focusing on the disaster remediation pipelines. When a hurricane hits the coast, millions of dollars are mobilized within 24 hours to secure flooded commercial properties. The data packets representing these funds carry a distinct digital signature. I noticed a subtle, almost invisible anomaly in the routing headers. Normally, a legitimate payment request for a fire-damaged roof follows a rigid, deeply entrenched path. It hits the initial adjustment tier, requires a dual signature approval from both the insurance adjuster and our internal compliance officer, and then routes directly to the primary clearinghouse for disbursement. But these specific packets were quietly detouring. They were being seamlessly funneled away from the main highway right before the final compliance check. The routing logic pushed them through a secondary cluster. On the main network map, this cluster was innocuously labeled as a beta testing sandbox. It was explicitly designed to be a safe, completely isolated playground for the engineering team to test new software patches without disrupting the live environment. Instead, someone had secretly bridged the sandbox to the external financial gateway. It was functioning as a highly efficient, entirely invisible toll booth for real money. I spent 4 hours digging deep into the recipients of these diverted funds. The contractors receiving these massive payouts were absolute ghosts. I pulled their public business registries and found they had legal profiles thinner than a single sheet of paper. There was no history of actual construction work, no heavy machinery registered to their names, and no employee tax records. I cross-referenced the vendor identification numbers and found glaring, undeniable patterns. 3 completely different corporate entities, supposedly handling massive structural repairs across 3 different states, were all registered to the exact same post office box in a desolate strip mall in Delaware. They were classic, textbook shell companies. They were digital buckets specifically constructed to catch the millions of dollars raining down from the emergency relief funds, hold the cash just long enough to wash it, and then disappear without a trace. While I was slowly unraveling this massive, tangled knot of fraud, Soren Pike made it his daily mission to hover around my workstation. The board's hand-picked consultant did not act like a man trying to learn a new job. A real apprentice asks how a process works, taking detailed notes to understand the mechanics. Soren asked where the master keys were hidden. He would show up around 10 in the morning, lean against the edge of my desk holding a cup of overpriced coffee, and ask overly specific, highly dangerous questions. "Hey, Arya," Soren said one morning, trying his best to sound casually interested while staring intensely at my screen. "If the main compliance node goes down for maintenance, where exactly are the hard-coded bypass triggers stored on the local drive?" He was not trying to understand the ecosystem. He was a burglar casually asking the homeowner where they kept the spare alarm code. I gave him vague, perfectly polite non-answers, burying him in pointless technical jargon, but his constant, looming presence felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He was quietly mapping the exits. Then, Micah Dunn decided to join the offensive. For the past 5 years, our glorious Chief Technology Officer had never once asked me how the system functioned, so long as his email loaded fast and the servers did not crash during his afternoon golf games. Suddenly, On a random Tuesday afternoon, he marched into the engineering bay with a tight, incredibly anxious expression on his face. "Arya, we need to completely standardize the handover documentation," Micah stated, crossing his arms in a weak, transparent attempt at authority. "I want a comprehensive map of all administrative gateways and emergency overrides printed, bound, and on my desk by the end of the week." He was trying to extract the final blueprint before they violently pushed me out the door. The raw panic in his voice was palpable, a stark, pathetic contrast to his usual arrogant, untouchable demeanor. He needed the instruction manual because he knew the men he was protecting were playing with live ammunition. There was only one person on the entire executive floor who seemed to possess even a tiny shred of a conscience, though she buried it deep beneath thick layers of self-preservation. Claire Norwood was an independent board member, brought in to provide objective oversight. During our monthly infrastructure briefings, I would occasionally catch her staring at me across the polished mahogany table. Her eyes held a tight, deeply anxious gleam. Once, after a particularly tense meeting about budget allocations, she lingered near the doorway of the boardroom. She opened her mouth, taking a sharp breath as if she were about to warn me about the incoming storm. But then she glanced down the long hallway, saw Preston Hale walking toward us with his usual predatory stride, and quickly snapped her mouth shut. She walked away without a single word. She knew a significant piece of the truth. She knew the ice under my feet was cracking, but she was absolutely terrified to step away from the warm safety of the executive consensus. The final, utterly chilling revelation came late on a Thursday night. I was running a deep-level audit on the administrative access logs, searching for any anomalies in the credential registry. I scrolled past thousands of lines of mundane automated code until a specific timestamp caught my eye and literally froze the blood in my veins. It was a root-level administrative command executed at exactly 3 a.m. on a Sunday. The command had forcefully bypassed a standard firewall restriction to authorize a massive data transfer directly into the shadow testing environment. I carefully checked the user identification tag attached to the command. My heart stopped beating for a full, terrifying second. It was my own credential token. Administrator Crawford. I had been fast asleep in my bed at 3 a.m. on that specific Sunday. I had not logged into the network. I had not authorized a single transfer. Someone had successfully copied, or perfectly spoofed, my high-level security token. The air in the server room suddenly felt dangerously thin, as if the cooling fans were sucking the oxygen straight out of my lungs. The entire landscape of the threat shifted violently in a single heartbeat. This was no longer just a hostile, unfair corporate termination. They were not merely pushing me out the door to protect their dirty secret. They had methodically paved a road to lay the entire blame squarely on my shoulders. If the upcoming bank audit detected the missing money, the executives would simply feign shock, hire an outside investigation firm, and point directly to the digital logs. The logs would perfectly show the rogue, disgruntled systems architect manipulating the remediation funds late at night. They were setting me up to take the absolute fall for massive financial fraud. I would not just lose my career, I would go to federal prison for a very long time. Panic is a highly contagious, destructive instinct. It makes you want to scream, to violently confront your enemies, to burn everything down in a fit of righteous, blinding fury. But I knew with absolute certainty that if I reacted with emotion, I was playing directly into their carefully constructed narrative. They desperately wanted a hysterical, angry technician they could easily discredit to the authorities. I sat back slowly in my ergonomic chair, staring coldly at the damning line of code glowing on my monitor. I forced my breathing to slow down, matching the steady, relentless rhythm of the servers around me. I could not fight them with expensive corporate lawyers, and I certainly could not fight them with ruthless boardroom politics. But I could fight them on my own battlefield. If they wanted to use my system to frame me, I was going to use that exact same system to trap them. I had to do the one thing I was vastly better at than anyone else in that towering glass building. I was going to turn the silent, invisible architecture of the network into an unimpeachable, permanent witness. If I had panicked, the absolute easiest thing to do would have been to destroy it all. I possess the root access required to wipe the primary databases completely clean, deploy a self-replicating ransomware worm into the core memory, or simply unplug the virtual servers and watch their entire enterprise crash to a violent halt. But doing any of that would have been an incredible, unforgivable mistake. Destruction is exactly what Gideon, Preston, and Micah were silently praying for. A catastrophic network failure would instantly turn me into the chaotic, vengeful saboteur they so desperately needed to complete their fabricated narrative. It would give them the absolute perfect excuse to explain away the missing millions of dollars to the federal authorities. They would just point at the ruined server racks and claim the disgruntled systems architect burned the financial ledgers on her way out the door. I was not going to give them a scapegoat. I was not going to plant a digital bomb beneath their leather chairs. I was simply going to remove the heavy velvet curtain they had forced me to sew. Years ago, long before the massive hurricane remediation funds became a personal, secret piggy bank for the executive board, I had written a highly specialized contingency failsafe. I named it Mirror Harbor. In the highly volatile, unpredictable tech industry, sudden departures of senior engineers are a massive operational hazard. Mirror Harbor was specifically designed as a legal, fully documented dead man's switch for the core network infrastructure. Its original purpose was purely protective and entirely transparent. If my primary cryptographic signature was ever abruptly revoked from the main system directory without a standard, multi-tiered handover protocol being completed, meaning if I was hit by a bus, or in this exact case, summarily fired and locked out the system would automatically assume the network was in a state of severe, unmanaged risk. Under normal, everyday operations, I maintained a highly secure executive partition. It was a customized set of digital blinders I built to keep highly sensitive internal communications and early-stage financial maneuvers shielded from lower-level employees and basic vendors. I had unknowingly, dutifully, placed their fraudulent shell company transactions right inside this protective bubble, thinking I was guarding legitimate trade secrets. But the governing logic of Mirror Harbor dictated that if the lead architect was suddenly removed without proper, documented authorization from the Engineering Compliance Board, those specific data partitions would gently but firmly drop. The architectural reasoning was simple and legally undeniable. Without the primary architect there to manage and monitor the risk, absolute transparency had to be immediately restored to the external stakeholders to prevent a catastrophic system failure. I did not need to write new, malicious code. I only needed to wake up the sleeping protocol. I sat quietly at my terminal, the harsh white light reflecting off my glasses, my fingers moving across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, rhythmic precision. I packaged the Mirror Harbor activation sequence inside a completely standard, highly routine rollback compliance update. To any external auditor, or even to a nervous, poorly trained consultant like Soren Pike, the code package looked exactly like a mundane safety mechanism designed to back up system permissions before a busy weekend. I meticulously filled out the technical release notes, using the exact dry corporate terminology required by our internal manuals. It was a flawless piece of digital camouflage. It was not a weapon of sabotage. It was strict, uncompromising compliance. But setting the trap was only half the battle. I had to make absolutely sure the jaws would not snap back on me when the dust finally settled. I spent the next 4 hours creating an unbreakable, immutable chain of digital evidence. I pulled the original design schematics for Mirror Harbor from the deep archives, clearly showing it had been vetted, tested, and officially approved by the compliance team over 3 years ago. I generated secure, unalterable timestamps for every single keystroke I made that evening. I carefully cross-referenced my system change tickets with the foundational security mandates of the company, proving that my actions were dictated by the rulebook they themselves had signed. I then encrypted this entire evidentiary package and scattered it across multiple highly secure external cloud repositories that the board did not even know existed. If they ever tried to drag me into a federal courtroom, I would have absolute, undeniable proof that every single action I took was entirely within the strict legal boundaries of protecting the corporate network. I was doing exactly what they paid me to do, The most crucial, delicate element of the entire operation was the timing. I could not let the partition drop the exact second they disabled my access badge. If the system immediately exposed the shadow ledgers while I was still standing in the main lobby holding a cardboard box of my belongings, they could easily argue that I had intentionally triggered a malicious incident on my way out the door out of pure spite. The retaliation would have to be significantly delayed. I carefully adjusted the activation timer within the Mirror Harbor code. I set it to execute precisely 48 hours after my primary heartbeat ping disappeared from the Central Administrative Registry. That specific time frame was a masterpiece of architectural revenge. 48 hours was long enough to provide me with a rock-solid, undeniable alibi of distance and time. I would be sitting peacefully in my living room, completely disconnected from their network, sipping coffee when the event occurred. However, it was also short enough to guarantee maximum collateral damage to their grand financial scheme. They were desperately rushing to close their massive refinancing round on Monday morning. They needed the incoming capital to cover up the gaping holes they had ripped in the disaster relief funds. By the time my customized timer quietly ran out over the weekend, the digital blinders would completely fall away. The highly suspicious transaction records, the grossly inflated invoices, and the overlapping physical addresses of their fake contractor companies would simultaneously become fully visible to the entities who had the legal right to see them during a critical risk assessment. The external credit monitoring units, the risk insurers who backed our corporate liability, and most importantly, the independent trustees overseeing the massive new loan contracts would all suddenly receive a beautifully clear, entirely unobstructed view of the rot festering beneath the floorboards. The system would automatically route the raw, unfiltered data logs directly to the external compliance officers. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and let my tired eyes drift toward the small digital calendar resting in the corner of my secondary monitor. Today was Wednesday. They had confidently scheduled my professional execution for Friday afternoon. They thought they had everything perfectly calculated. They truly believed they were quietly neutralizing the only remaining threat to their wealth, entirely unaware that the threat was not me, but the very infrastructure they stood upon. I slowly exhaled, feeling the tight, heavy knot of anxiety that had been sitting in my chest for weeks finally begin to unravel. I was not going to fight them in the boardroom. I was going to let them do exactly what they planned to do. I realized with absolute cold certainty that if they went through with firing me on Friday afternoon, by the time the sun came up early next week, I would not be the one losing a job. They would be losing control of the entire narrative. Friday morning arrived with an atmosphere so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. The entire office seemed to be holding its collective breath, vibrating with that specific, cowardly corporate energy that only surfaces when a public execution is on the schedule. Micah Dunn, our usually absent chief technology officer, suddenly found a dozen reasons to walk past my workstation. He paced the carpeted aisle behind my chair with the frantic, irregular steps of a caged animal, his eyes darting toward my monitors every time he passed. The mid-level infrastructure engineers, guys who usually spent their mornings debating database optimization, were suddenly highly interested in the ceiling tiles whenever I looked up, though I could feel their eyes boring into my screen the second I looked away. Even Vera Sloan from Human Resources made an unprecedented appearance on the engineering floor before lunch. She stopped by my desk to ask if the ambient temperature was comfortable. Wearing a smile so tightly stretched and artificially polite, it looked like it was physically hurting her face. By early afternoon, the invasion force arrived. A team of 3 external infrastructure specialists in sharply tailored suits was quietly ushered into the secondary conference room. They were clearly the highly paid mercenaries brought in to assume total control of my network the absolute second I was escorted off the premises. But through the open blinds, I watched their initial confidence evaporate. Soren Pike was standing at the head of their table, frantically pointing at a massive, printed schematic of the system architecture. The external experts were leaning in, their brows furrowed in deep, visible confusion. They were tracing the routing lines with their expensive pens, shaking their heads. They were slowly realizing that the map Soren provided was just the surface topography, and the actual living ecosystem underneath was vastly more complex than they had been promised. The final summons came exactly at 4:30 in the afternoon. A brief, sterile calendar notification popped up on my screen, devoid of any agenda, simply requesting my presence in the main glass boardroom. I locked my workstation, picked up my mobile device, and walked down the long corridor. When I pushed open the heavy glass door, the temperature in the room was remarkably cold. Gideon Vale, Preston Hale, and Vera Sloane were already seated in their usual positions of power. They looked like a tribunal prepared to hand down a sentence they had already decided days ago. "Please, take a seat," Gideon instructed, his voice as smooth and frictionless as polished marble. I sat down, placing my hands loosely in my lap. I was entirely relaxed. I was the one losing my livelihood, yet I was undeniably the calmest person in the room. Gideon did not waste time with pleasantries. He read the official termination decision with the casual, detached cadence of a man announcing a change in the office coffee supplier. He cited a strategic reorganization of the engineering department, a shift in operational priorities, and a mutual divergence of long-term goals. It was a masterfully crafted paragraph of absolute nonsense. Vera slid a thick stack of stapled documents across the gleaming mahogany table. "We need you to sign the immediate handover confirmation," she said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the signature line. "This acknowledges you are surrendering all primary access tokens, handing over all company-issued hardware, and legally committing to permanently severing any digital contact with our internal resources effective immediately." They wanted a clean, surgical amputation. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my security badge, and placed it on the table. I unstrapped my company smartphone and laid it precisely next to the badge. I took the heavy, silver pen Vera offered and signed my name on the exact line she indicated. My handwriting was perfectly steady. I handed over exactly what they believed was the total sum of my power. I gave them the plastic cards, the metal devices, and the visible passwords. What I entirely failed to mention was the automated, rotating cryptographic signature chain that silently maintained the stable partition state of the federated server cluster. They thought my access lived in the plastic badge sitting on the table. They did not understand that my presence was deeply embedded in the continuous, invisible heartbeat of the network itself. By forcing me to stop touching the digital resources, they were actively severing the exact lifeline that kept their fraudulent shadow ledgers safely hidden from the external auditors. Vera gathered the signed documents, a look of profound relief washing over her tight features. She stacked them neatly, aligning the edges with meticulous care. Then, she looked up at me, attempting to project an aura of empathetic professionalism. "Do you have any final questions regarding the transition?" Vera asked, her tone dripping with false sympathy. I did not look at Vera. I shifted my gaze, making direct, unbroken eye contact with the men who truly controlled the room. I looked at Gideon, who was already reaching for his phone, and then at Preston, who was busily checking his silver wristwatch. "Just one," I said, my voice quiet but incredibly clear, cutting through the sterile air of the boardroom like a scalpel. "When exactly will you realize that the person shadowing me for the past month has never once touched the live stack?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was not a thoughtful pause. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. Gideon stopped reaching for his phone. Vera froze with her hands resting on the paperwork. Soren Pike had spent weeks standing over my shoulder, taking aggressive notes, and asking dangerous questions about master keys and bypass triggers. But because I knew exactly what he was doing, I had permanently locked him in a simulated environment. Every single test he ran, every directory he mapped, and every operational protocol he thought he had mastered was contained entirely within a harmless, isolated sandbox. He had never actually interacted with the living, breathing production servers. The man they were relying on to keep their massive financial fraud safely running through the weekend was essentially trained on a highly realistic video game. Nobody in the boardroom had an answer, but the subtle, devastating shift in the room's power dynamic was unmistakable. The arrogant smirk entirely vanished from Gideon's face, but it was Preston Hale who gave them away. The chief financial officer's expression visibly faltered. The color drained slightly from his cheeks, and a dark, rigid calculation entered his eyes. He was the man responsible for the money, and in that split second, the seed of genuine, terrifying doubt took root in his mind. He suddenly realized they were driving a massive, high-speed vehicle, and they had just thrown the only person who knew how to use the brakes out of the window. "Security will escort you out," Gideon finally said, his voice entirely stripped of its former smooth confidence. It sounded brittle, forced out through a tightened jaw. I stood up, pushing my chair back. I did not say another word. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, meeting the two large security guards waiting patiently in the hallway. My departure was a slow, highly visible procession through the center of the engineering floor. The entire department was dead silent. Telephones rang unanswered. Keyboards were completely still. My colleagues watched me with wide, anxious eyes as I was marched toward the main elevator banks. The guards flanked me, their faces completely impassive, fulfilling their solemn duty to protect the corporate fortress from the newly designated threat. When the heavy steel doors of the elevator finally slid closed, cutting off my view of the office for the last time, the guards relaxed slightly. But I remained perfectly upright, staring at the digital floor indicator counting down to the ground level. They thought they had decisively won. They believed they had effectively sterilized the environment, cleanly closing a heavy iron door on a massive structural vulnerability. They were going to spend the weekend celebrating their ruthless efficiency, preparing to finalize their massive loan on Monday morning. As I stepped out into the warm, late-afternoon air of the city, a small, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. They had not closed a door at all. They had blindly reached into the dark, fumbled for the controls, and forcefully pressed the start button on a devastating, invisible countdown clock. And the absolute best part was that they had absolutely no idea how little time they had left. The peace of the weekend did not even have the chance to fully settle over my home before they came hunting for me. By Saturday evening, the quiet sanctuary of my townhouse was repeatedly shattered by the aggressive vibration of my personal smartphone. At first, it was just one missed call from an unknown number. Then, within the span of a single hour, there were 15 missed calls and over 20 frantic text messages. I did not recognize the numbers, but I recognized the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from the flashing screen. I simply placed the device face down on my kitchen counter, poured myself a glass of water, and went to sleep with the absolute tranquility of a woman who knew exactly what the morning would bring. At precisely 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, a heavy, desperate pounding echoed against my front door. It was not the polite knock of a delivery driver. It was the frantic hammering of someone whose world was actively collapsing. I walked to the foyer, checked the security camera feed, and smiled coldly. Preston Hale was standing on my porch. The chief financial officer, a man who built his entire terrifying reputation on pristine tailored suits and absolute composure, looked utterly dismantled. His expensive silk tie was gone, his collar was completely unbuttoned, and his usually immaculate hair was a disheveled mess. He was sweating despite the cool morning breeze, shifting his weight from foot to foot with a raw, naked desperation I had never seen from him before. I opened the door slowly, leaving the heavy brass chain firmly secured. I looked at him without a single trace of emotion. "Arya," Preston gasped, his voice tight and breathless. "You need to come back to the building with me right now." "You formally terminated my employment on Friday afternoon," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat and polite. "I surrendered my security credentials. I am legally barred from accessing your network." "Forget Friday," Preston practically begged, gripping the edge of the doorframe. His knuckles were completely white. "We can undo all of that. The system has not crashed, but it is behaving incredibly erratically. It is acting like it has a mind of its own." I tilted my head, waiting for him to confess exactly how badly my invisible trap had mangled his weekend. The invoice reconciliations are completely broken, Preston explained, his words tumbling out in a rushed, terrified whisper. The numbers are no longer matching up. Our executive administrative access is actively narrowing by the hour. Folders we controlled yesterday are suddenly locked down this morning, and the worst part is the summary dashboards. The specific financial summaries we prepared for the bank audit tomorrow morning are suddenly bypassing the filters and pulling the raw, unedited data streams directly from the historical ledgers. He swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear. He did not say the word fraud, but it hung heavily in the air between us. He was terrified because the fake numbers were disappearing, and the real, damning numbers were violently pushing their way to the surface. "I can immediately triple your previous salary," Preston offered, his voice rising in a desperate bid to buy my loyalty. "I can authorize a massive stock bonus package right here, right now. We will draft a brand new non-disclosure agreement, highly lucrative, and we can just call Friday a terrible organizational misunderstanding. Just come back and fix it." His frantic bargaining proved everything I needed to know. This was not a standard information technology emergency. If a regular server had simply failed, they would have yelled at Soren Pike to reboot it. The fact that the chief financial officer was standing on my porch, offering me a fortune to resolve a software glitch, meant the digital curtain was tearing apart, and they were staring directly into the abyss of a federal investigation. They had absolutely no idea what was actually happening beneath the surface. They only knew that whatever was hiding in the shadows was about to sink their massive refinancing deal on Monday morning. As Preston continued to ramble about executive privileges and bonus structures, my phone vibrated softly in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the locked screen. It was a short, encrypted message from Elena Tate, the general counsel of the company. Elena was a fiercely intelligent, intensely guarded woman who practically lived in the shadows of the legal department, quietly keeping the executives out of jail. Her message contained only 2 brief sentences. "Do not go back alone. They need a full confession, not a technical fix." The warning hit me with a sharp jolt of clarity. Elena knew the play. Gideon and Preston were not bringing me back to save the company. They were bringing me back to officially frame me. They had realized they could not stop the data from leaking to the auditors, so their backup plan was to force me into a room, intimidate me into touching a keyboard, and legally document me as the rogue hacker actively destroying their ledgers. They needed a scapegoat sitting directly in the center of the blast radius. "Give me 10 minutes to change," I told Preston, shutting the door firmly in his face before he could argue. I had already decided to return, but I was not going to walk blindly onto their execution block. I moved quickly and methodically. I deliberately left my company laptop and all external hard drives sitting uselessly on the kitchen island. I sent a detailed timeline of my location and the nature of the meeting to my private attorney. Finally, I opened a secure, hidden application on my phone, establishing a continuous, live audio broadcasting channel that routed directly to my lawyer's secure server. I did not dress like an engineer rushing to fix a broken server rack. I put on a sharp, dark charcoal blazer, a high-collared shirt, and tailored trousers. I dressed precisely like a woman walking into a hostile legal interrogation. I was not there to rescue them. I was there to witness their demise. I walked out to the street and climbed into the back seat of Preston's waiting luxury town car. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was suffocatingly tense. Preston sat in the front passenger seat, practically climbing over the center console as he barked frantically into his mobile phone. "Yes, she is in the car," Preston said to whoever was on the other end, his voice tight with a strange, nervous energy. "She is fully cooperating. We are 10 minutes away. Just have the paperwork ready." He repeated the phrase, "she is cooperating," 3 separate times during the short drive across the city. He was not talking to an IT manager. He was setting a very specific stage. He was broadcasting to his co-conspirators that the bait had been successfully swallowed, and the main act was about to begin. When we finally arrived at corporate headquarters, the massive building was eerily empty, a towering monument of glass and steel stripped of its usual Sunday calm. Preston practically sprinted toward the main elevator banks, his hands shaking as he swiped his executive access card. The heavy steel doors slid open onto the executive floor, and the sheer scale of their panic was immediately visible. The sleek, pristine corridors were littered with empty coffee cups and discarded papers. We walked rapidly toward the main glass boardroom. It had been completely transformed from a place of refined corporate strategy into a chaotic, desperate emergency center. Gideon Vale was pacing the length of the room, his face pale and drawn. Micah Dunn was aggressively typing on a laptop, sweat pouring down his forehead. Soren Pike was standing in the corner, looking completely paralyzed with fear. Lawyers in crumpled suits were arguing loudly over scattered printouts. But my eyes immediately bypassed all the panicked men in the room and locked onto the massive digital display screen mounted on the far wall. It was projecting the core system monitoring dashboard. The others in the room were staring at it as if it were a bomb they did not know how to defuse. They saw fluctuating graphs and scrolling lines of red error text, but I saw something entirely different. In the upper right corner of the dashboard, a small, highly encrypted system clock was silently ticking downward. It was the Mirror Harbor failsafe timer. The countdown had not stopped. The executives thought they had brought me back to freeze the clock. They had no idea that my mere presence in the room meant absolutely nothing to the automated architecture. I stood quietly in the doorway, staring at the screen, knowing that I was the only person in the entire building who truly understood exactly what that ticking clock was counting down toward. "Sit down and fix exactly what you just did to my company," Gideon Vale demanded, his voice cracking with a harsh, brittle authority that completely lacked its usual polished resonance. He pointed a trembling finger toward the primary terminal at the head of the massive mahogany table. Soren Pike was hovering nervously right behind the leather executive chair. The highly paid consultant was sweating profusely, his chest heaving with shallow, rapid breaths. He looked exactly like a man who had confidently picked a lock, only to realize the heavy steel door was actually keeping a massive, hungry predator trapped inside. He had spent the entire weekend staring at the cascading error logs, utterly paralyzed by the sheer complexity of the disaster unfolding across the monitors. I walked slowly to the head of the table. I did not rush. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down. I did not immediately reach for the keyboard. I did not touch the mouse. I simply leaned back and let my eyes trace the chaotic streams of data scrolling endlessly down the massive digital projection screen covering the far wall of the boardroom. The entire room held its collective breath, desperately waiting for me to type a miraculous sequence of code that would save their lucrative careers. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch for 2 full minutes. I wanted them to feel the absolute, crushing weight of their own ignorance. Finally, I turned my head, making direct eye contact with Gideon. "There is absolutely nothing to fix," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls. "Nothing is broken. The system is simply returning to its correct, contractual state." The blood completely drained from Preston Hale's face. "What are you talking about?" the chief financial officer demanded, his voice rising to an undignified shriek. "The executive access is totally locked out. The internal folders are rejecting our administrative passwords. The data streams are completely corrupted." "The data is not corrupted," I corrected him smoothly, speaking with the measured, deliberate cadence of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a particularly slow student. "It is just finely accurate. The executive partition you all relied upon so heavily was never a baseline feature of the corporate network. It was a supplementary, highly complex camouflage layer that I personally constructed. I built it to protect our proprietary operational data during a very aggressive phase of corporate growth. However, that specific partition required continuous, authenticated maintenance from the lead infrastructure architect." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the terrified faces of the executive board. "When you arrogantly chose to sever my cryptographic signature on Friday afternoon without executing a sanctioned, multi-tiered technical handover, you triggered a fundamental safety protocol. The core architecture was forced to classify the sudden, unexplained loss of the primary system architect as a severe governance risk event. Micah Dunn, the chief technology officer who had blindly signed off on my termination, gripped the edge of the table. "A risk event means what, exactly?" he whispered, dread thick in his throat. "It means the digital blinders have been permanently removed," I explained coldly. "Every single concealed transaction log, every blind contractor approval, all the deeply buried disaster remediation reconciliations, and the unedited internal communications are currently bypassing your executive filters. Because the system detected a catastrophic failure in internal leadership, it is automatically synchronizing all of that hidden data directly to the external verification portals. The credit monitoring agencies, the risk insurers, and the independent trustee overseeing the new loan covenants are receiving the raw, unfiltered truth as we speak." Behind me, Soren Pike let out a sharp, strangled gasp. He stepped closer to the primary monitor, his eyes darting frantically across a specific table of hardware registry keys. The color completely vanished from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. "The serial keys," Soren muttered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. He looked at Micah, raw terror in his eyes. "The Phantom Contractor Payment Cluster and the Executive Testing Sandbox. They are not logically separated. They share the exact same physical hardware footprint." The implication hung in the air like a guillotine blade. By exposing the raw hardware logs, the system proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the fraudulent shell companies draining the hurricane relief funds were operating on the exact same physical server racks as the CEO's private network. It was now mathematically impossible for them to blame the massive financial drain on external hackers or rogue offshore entities. The digital fingerprints proved the theft was coming from inside the boardroom. Hiding the massive fraud was no longer a viable option. Preston snapped, the polished veneer of the wealthy, disciplined executive completely shattered. He lunged forward across the expensive table, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His large hand clamped down viciously on my left forearm, his fingers digging painfully into my jacket sleeve. "Stop the transfer!" Preston screamed, spittle flying from his lips. He violently turned his head toward the entrance. "Lock the doors. Do not let her leave this room until she shuts this down." The two large corporate security guards standing nervously in the hallway immediately stepped into the doorframe, crossing their arms and blocking the only exit. Preston genuinely believed that if he could just physically trap me in this glass box for another 30 minutes, he could somehow magically save the tens of millions of dollars slipping through his fingers. I did not flinch. I did not try to pull my arm away. I looked down at his shaking, aggressive hand, and then raised my gaze to meet his frantic, bloodshot eyes. I maintained absolute, terrifying stillness. "My private attorney is currently listening to a live, highly encrypted audio feed streaming directly from my mobile device," I informed him, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "Furthermore, I flagged all the hallway security cameras for permanent legal retention before I even stepped out of the elevator. Every single word you just screamed, and the physical assault you are currently committing, is already safely stored on an external server." Preston froze, his pupils dilating in shock. "If you do not remove your hand from my arm, and if you do not immediately instruct those two men to step away from the glass doors," I continued, my words sharp and precise, "you are going to instantly escalate your current situation from massive federal financial fraud to a very direct, undeniable criminal charge of false imprisonment. Make your choice." For 3 agonizing seconds, no one in the room breathed. Then, slowly, Preston released his grip. He stumbled backward, his hands raised slightly in the air, looking incredibly small and utterly defeated. The 2 security guards nervously stepped out of the doorway, retreating into the corridor. The executives were completely paralyzed, caught in a terrifying limbo where they no longer knew whether they should scream violent threats or drop to their knees and beg for mercy. Right at that exact moment of absolute silence, the massive digital screen on the wall chimed with a series of sharp, cheerful audio alerts. The first wave of automated confirmation notifications began to cascade down the monitor. The external portals were verifying receipt of the data. The massive commercial lenders had the unedited files. The risk insurers had the raw invoice histories. The independent trustees had the hardware logs. The damage was permanently done, and the information was completely out of their hands. But as the logs continued to scroll rapidly down the screen, a secondary diagnostic window suddenly populated in the bottom corner. I stared at the new lines of code, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, genuine shock pierced my carefully maintained composure. The system was automatically pulling the deep archived administrative access histories to send to the external auditors. As the raw data materialized, I saw a highly specific, hidden sequence of root-level commands executing unauthorized copies of my exact personal security token. I checked the digital timestamps attached to the cloning commands. They were not from last week. They were not from the day they fired me. The timestamps were from exactly 4 months ago. The revelation hit me like a physical shockwave. Long before I had even started actively questioning the strange anomalies in the hurricane repair funds, someone inside this very company had been meticulously, quietly building a perfect digital trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to my desk. They had not just decided to use me as a convenient scapegoat when I got too close to the truth. They had purposely selected me as their sacrificial lamb from the very beginning. They had always planned to push me into the fire when the time came, and now, the entire room was going to burn down with them. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the financial landscape of the company was completely paralyzed. The massive refinancing deal, which the executive board desperately needed to cover their fraudulent tracks, was instantly frozen by the lenders. Several major commercial building owners, upon receiving the automated alerts from the dropped partition, immediately halted all ongoing cooperation and suspended their emergency repair contracts. Whispers of a severe system issue and potential financial discrepancies began to spread through the highly insulated real estate finance sector like a virulent contagion. But the executive board did not simply cower in their glass towers. When they realized they could no longer hide the raging fire, they immediately executed their contingency plan to find someone else to throw directly into the flames. They launched a ruthless, highly coordinated counterattack. Before noon, the corporate communications office released a carefully worded internal memo that inevitably leaked to the financial press within minutes. The document did not explicitly name me, but it painted a devastatingly clear picture. It cited a disgruntled former employee who, deeply dissatisfied with organizational restructuring, had allegedly weaponized their high-level administrative access to effectively hold the company infrastructure hostage. The true, horrifying danger of their accusation was that to any outside observer, it did not look completely absurd. The fabricated administrative commands buried deep within the network were explicitly carrying my unique digital identification token. To the external auditors, the independent trustees, and the federal regulators who were now circling the company, I was the absolute perfect suspect. I was the architect who possessed the supreme technical capability, and thanks to the carefully documented history of my recent termination, I now seemingly possessed the malicious motive. By Monday afternoon, the media hunt had officially begun. Industry reporters began swarming my professional networking profiles, digging through my past employment history, and attempting to contact my former university professors. My phone vibrated endlessly with requests for comment from investigative journalists. For the first few hours of that chaotic day, sitting alone in my darkened living room with the blinds drawn tightly shut, I finally understood the terrifying, profoundly isolating sensation of having the very fortress I had painstakingly built turn its heavy artillery directly at my own chest. Late that evening, a burner phone I had purchased earlier in the day received a heavily encrypted text message. It was a secure location pin for a multi-story concrete parking structure on the desolate outskirts of the city. I arrived an hour later, stepping out of my vehicle into the cold, damp air of the underground garage. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows across the oil-stained concrete. Elena Tate, the general counsel, stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. She wore a dark trench coat, her face partially obscured by the shadows, looking every bit like a woman risking her own freedom to deliver a warning. Elena did not offer any pleasantries. She silently handed me a thin manila folder containing a single photocopy. "Do not tell anyone where you got this," she whispered, her voice tight with genuine fear. "They are actively preparing to hand you over to the federal authorities by Wednesday morning." I opened the folder under the dim overhead light. It was a highly classified copy of the internal legal meeting minutes from exactly 3 months ago. I scanned the rigid corporate text and felt the remaining breath leave my lungs. Gideon Vale had officially requested a comprehensive simulation of the lead architect's security keys. He had submitted the request to the compliance department under the completely innocent guise of succession planning and emergency legacy testing. They had systematically mapped my digital fingerprints, successfully creating a phantom key that could execute commands completely indistinguishable from my own. "They have been building the scaffolding for your execution for an entire quarter," Elena stated coldly, stepping back into the shadows. "You need more than just your word to survive this. You need a bulletproof alibi." The situation escalated violently the following morning when Soren Pike entirely broke down. The highly paid consultant, seeing the sheer magnitude of the federal investigation crashing down upon the company, understood that he was dangerously close to becoming collateral damage. He called my private attorney in a state of absolute weeping panic, begging for a way to secure immunity. My lawyer set up a secure conference call, and Soren confessed everything. He admitted, his voice cracking with terror, that the board never actually intended for him to replace me. He lacked the fundamental skills to manage a system of that magnitude, and they knew it. He was hired for a much darker, incredibly specific purpose. He was brought in to closely observe my daily routines, to study my coding syntax, and to memorize my operational workflows. When the time eventually came for the company to need a scapegoat, Soren was going to stand before a federal judge as an expert technical witness. He was going to swear under oath that all the suspicious, fraudulent system manipulations perfectly matched my unique behavioral habits. The walls were rapidly closing in, engineered by men who understood exactly how to manipulate the corporate legal system. But as I sat in my home office, staring at the fabricated software logs Elena had provided, a sudden, brilliant spark of memory ignited in my mind. They had successfully compromised the software. They had spoofed my digital tokens and perfectly imitated my keystrokes. But software is ultimately just a malleable illusion. It exists entirely in a virtual space that can be manipulated by anyone holding the right master password. I remembered the early days of building the data center. I had an inherent, deeply ingrained distrust of relying solely on virtual logs. Software can lie, but physics cannot. 2 years ago, I had quietly constructed a completely independent, immutable physical recording layer within the basement server room. I had installed isolated sensors that tracked the mechanical opening of the heavy steel doors. I had integrated the ambient cooling thermostats and the massive electrical power consumption meters into a standalone, read-only physical hard drive. It was a raw, unalterable ledger of the physical reality inside that room. If a server rack suddenly spiked in power consumption to process a massive data transfer, the electrical meter recorded the exact millisecond of the surge, entirely separate from the software telling the network what was happening. I securely connected to the hidden, encrypted backdoor of my physical environmental monitor. The executives had completely stripped my software access, but this was a separate hardware relay they did not even know existed. I cross-referenced the precise dates and times of the fraudulent administrative commands from the legal documents with the raw physical logs of the basement server facility. I scrolled through lines of temperature readings and voltage spikes until I finally found it, the ultimate, brutally beautiful piece of undeniable evidence. According to the fabricated software logs, a massive illegal transfer of hurricane relief funds had been authorized by my specific administrative credential at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday. But the physical entry logs told the absolute truth. At that exact moment, the heavy magnetic door to the basement server room had been physically unlocked and opened. The system recorded the precise badge swipe used to gain physical entry to the terminal that executed the command. I stared at the screen, a slow, triumphant smile breaking across my face in the darkness of my office. On that specific Thursday, at 2 o'clock in the morning, I was halfway across the country, giving a keynote presentation at a cybersecurity conference in Chicago. I had hotel receipts, flight records, and hundreds of witnesses to prove my geographical location. I could not have been the one to authorize the transfer, because the physical badge that had unlocked the basement door, stepping into the freezing server room to type the command that stole millions of dollars, belonged to Micah Dunn. The chief technology officer had personally walked into the basement to execute the theft, falsely using my name, completely unaware that the very room itself was silently watching him do it. The war room was established in a windowless conference room deep within my private attorney's downtown firm. Over the next 48 hours, the sterile space became a meticulous assembly line of truth. Elena Tate arrived through the freight elevator, bringing encrypted flash drives containing the unredacted corporate minutes. We were soon joined by a highly specialized team of forensic advisors representing the primary creditors. We did not just have isolated pieces of data anymore. We were actively stitching together a comprehensive timeline. We mapped the technical logs against the executive travel schedules, the payment flows, and the hardware heat signatures. It was no longer a guessing game. It was a rigorous, undeniable mathematical proof. "Look at the valuation dates," one of the creditor advisors said, tapping a silver pen against a printed spreadsheet. "They are not just stealing the repair funds. They are using the fake contractor invoices to officially classify severely storm-damaged properties as fully remediated." As we aligned the data, the true terrifying scope of their ambition finally crystallized. By artificially injecting these fake completion certificates into the system, they drastically inflated the total valuation of the commercial real estate portfolio. They were actively pumping up the numbers to lock in their massive new refinancing loan at a highly favorable premium. The cruelty of their exit strategy was breathtaking. Elena placed a confidential human resources memo on the table. Once the new capital successfully hit the accounts, they intended to manufacture a devastating internal security incident, she explained, her voice thick with disgust. They needed a catastrophic event to neatly explain to the external auditors why all the physical structural integrity reports and vendor receipts were suddenly missing. Their ultimate plan was to declare a massive cyber breach, initiate a sweeping company-wide layoff targeting the entire engineering department, and permanently bury every trace of their fraud under the convenient guise of a hacked server cluster. They were going to burn the entire technology division to the ground just to keep themselves warm. But a conspiracy that large requires absolute loyalty, and panic is the ultimate solvent for corporate solidarity. Late on Wednesday evening, we received a highly unexpected piece of leverage. Claire Norwood, the historically silent independent board member, finally stepped out of the shadows. Claire was not stepping forward out of a sudden, righteous sense of morality. She was a deeply pragmatic woman who recognized that the ship was rapidly taking on water. She knew Gideon Vale better than anyone, and she understood that when the federal regulators finally arrived, the chairman would not hesitate to sacrifice the entire independent board to save his own reputation. To protect herself, Claire had arranged a highly discreet meeting with Elena. "I have my own backups," Claire had told her, handing over a sealed drive. "Gideon is building a lifeboat for one. I refuse to drown for his mistakes." She provided a hidden cache of duplicated meeting transcripts and private executive memorandums. Her documentation explicitly proved that the board was fully aware of the architectural discrepancies long before they ever decided to terminate my employment. She was not entirely innocent in the cover-up, but her survival instinct handed us the exact weapon we needed to shatter their narrative of blissful executive ignorance. Armed with Claire's files, I executed a deep, targeted sweep of the recovered internal communications. I bypassed the standard executive mailboxes and dug directly into the heavily encrypted routing tables of the server. I was looking for the final destination of the diverted funds, and the architecture did not disappoint me. Following the digital trail of two specific phantom construction companies, I uncovered a series of nested offshore holding accounts. I stripped away the layers of legal obfuscation until I found the foundational registration documents. The ultimate beneficiary of the shell companies was a private family trust. It was Gideon Vale's personal family trust. The discovery fundamentally altered the legal battleground. This was no longer just a desperate attempt to hide operational failures or inflate property values for the bank. It was direct, premeditated embezzlement. The chairman of the board was intentionally funneling corporate disaster relief funds directly into his own pockets, creating a massive, highly illegal conflict of interest. He had weaponized the suffering of ruined commercial districts to line his own family accounts. The massive financial institutions holding the company debt did not wait for the dust to settle. By Thursday morning, the primary lenders, the independent risk insurers, and the legal trustee overseeing the loan covenants officially mandated an emergency, closed-door disciplinary hearing. It was scheduled for the upcoming weekend. The stakes were absolute. Stratodyne Asset Response would either miraculously clear its name and restore investor confidence, or the board would be completely stripped of their autonomous governing power, placing the entire enterprise into immediate receivership. Gideon was not going to surrender quietly. Through Elena's back channels, we learned exactly how he was preparing to walk into that boardroom. He was polishing a brilliantly twisted, highly dramatic story. He planned to stand in front of the creditors and paint me as an unstable, emotionally volatile technical genius. He was going to argue that the transparent data partition was not a protective mechanism, but a malicious, premeditated weapon of technical coercion I had secretly built to extort the company. He would claim that my sudden termination triggered a vengeful, hysterical cyber attack designed to frame the innocent board members with fabricated data. He was banking his entire freedom on the assumption that wealthy bankers would always believe a charismatic chief executive officer in a tailored suit over a disgruntled systems engineer. As I sat in the dimly lit conference room, looking at the towering stacks of irrefutable evidence we had meticulously assembled, a profound shift occurred within me. For weeks, I had been running. I had been terrified, isolated, and desperately trying to keep my head above water while powerful men tried to drown me in their lies. I had been fighting purely for basic survival. But looking at the timeline, the physical access logs, and the direct financial links to Gideon's trust, the heavy knot of fear in my chest completely dissolved. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline sense of anticipation. It was a beautiful, terrifying feeling. I was no longer on the defensive. I was no longer the hunted prey trying to dodge their attacks. I carefully packed the legal documents into my leather briefcase, the satisfying click of the brass locks echoing in the quiet room. I was ready. I was deeply, thoroughly prepared for the exact moment when the men who had arrogantly laughed at my career would be forced to sit under the harsh, unforgiving light of the public truth and desperately try to explain away every single lie they had ever told. The emergency disciplinary hearing was convened on Saturday morning in the largest, most intimidating auditorium of the downtown financial district. The massive room was packed far beyond its official capacity. Highly paid corporate lawyers in dark suits lined the back walls. Severe, unsmiling representatives from the major commercial banks occupied the front rows alongside the independent loan trustees. Scattered throughout the heavy oak benches were dozens of anxious senior managers and mid-level directors, physically shaking with nerves, absolutely terrified they would not have a paycheck by the end of the week. Gideon Vale approached the heavy wooden podium first. He delivered a flawless, practiced performance. He smoothed his expensive silk tie, leaned into the microphone, and spoke with deep, manufactured sorrow. He expertly painted me as a brilliant but highly emotional and deeply unstable engineer. He spun a compelling, tragic tale claiming that I was completely unable to handle a standard, necessary organizational restructuring. He explicitly told the silent room that I had maliciously weaponized the corporate infrastructure, launching a hysterical, vindictive cyber attack against the company the moment I was let go. Micah Dunn stepped up immediately after him, projecting the fabricated system logs onto the massive digital screen behind the podium. He pointed confidently at my specific digital identification token, which was brightly highlighted in red next to the fraudulent multi-million-dollar transfers. I did not wait for my attorney to formally object. I simply stood up from my seat, my voice carrying clearly and sharply across the cavernous auditorium. I looked directly into Micah's eyes and fired 3 consecutive, highly complex technical questions without pausing for a single breath. If I executed that root command at the exact time you claim, what was the active state of the cryptographic key rotation chain? What was the synchronization frequency of the primary thermal cooling sensors during that specific payload drop? And precisely which out-of-band transmission line did I use to bypass the hardware firewall? Micah completely froze. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again, but no sound came out. He stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the projection screen. He could not answer a single question. In 30 seconds, I had shown a room full of federal regulators and banking experts that the chief technology officer fundamentally did not understand the very system he was accusing me of manipulating. Desperate to regain control, the board called Soren Pike to the witness stand, fully expecting the highly paid consultant to validate their fabricated technical claims. But Soren took one look at the federal investigators sitting in the front row, holding their notebooks, and he completely broke down. He abandoned their carefully rehearsed script entirely. He loudly confessed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, that he was never actually hired to replace me. He tearfully admitted to the entire room that he was specifically contracted to study my operational habits, so he could expertly blame me if the internal control infrastructure was ever exposed to a financial audit. The auditorium erupted into a wave of shocked, furious murmurs. Elena Tate stood up calmly amidst the rising chaos and distributed thick stacks of paper to the bank representatives. She loudly announced that the documents were internal legal memorandums. They explicitly proved I was not fired due to an impartial corporate restructuring. I was abruptly terminated exactly 3 hours after I had officially submitted my 3rd formal warning regarding the highly anomalous shell company transactions. The board's whole story about my supposedly unprovoked emotional retaliation vanished in an instant, but I kept the final, decisive move in my own hands. I connected my secure drive to the podium and projected the raw physical server room data onto the massive screen. The heavy magnetic door entry logs, the raw electrical consumption metrics from the sub-basement server cluster, the sudden ambient cooling temperature drops, and the unalterable security camera timestamps all flashed before the crowd. I calmly explained to the room that on the exact nights the fraudulent financial commands were issued under my stolen digital identity, I was hundreds of miles away in another state. The physical logs proved undeniably that the only 2 men who had swiped their badges, opened that freezing server room door, and executed the massive thefts on those specific nights were Gideon Vale and Micah Dunn. The reaction from the financial stakeholders was instantaneous and absolutely merciless. The lead representative for the commercial lenders stood up and immediately declared a catastrophic, unrecoverable breach of the governance covenants. The independent trustee slammed his fist on the table and loudly demanded the on-the-spot removal of the entire executive management team. Before Gideon could even attempt to open his mouth to offer a defense, Claire Norwood and the rest of the independent board members officially moved to vote. Right there, in front of the packed, stunned auditorium, they unanimously stripped Gideon Vale and Preston Hale of all corporate control, revoking every single ounce of their operational authority. As the building security personnel moved in to physically escort the disgraced, pale executives out of the auditorium, Gideon suddenly stopped next to my table. His face was a twisted mask of pure, venomous hatred. He leaned down and hissed his final, desperate attempt to drag me into the dirt with him. "You built this system too," he spat. I looked up at him, my expression completely serene, and delivered the cleanest cut of the entire war. "Yes," I replied smoothly. "I built the system to protect everyone's assets. You only used it to hide your hands." The aftermath was resolved swiftly over the next 48 hours. The massive frozen hurricane repair funds were immediately transferred to the strict oversight of the independent loan trustee. The extensive files detailing the phantom shell contractors were handed directly to the federal financial investigators for criminal prosecution. Stratodyne Asset Response was plunged into a forced, rigorous corporate restructuring program. Crucially, the lower-level engineers and the innocent operational staff were completely spared from becoming the sacrificial victims Gideon had originally planned. A few days later, the new interim board of directors formally offered me a highly lucrative, incredibly powerful executive seat on the board. I firmly declined the offer. I accepted a highly paid, strictly independent consultancy role with a single specific mandate to redesign a new, perfectly transparent architecture for their entire network. The executives had always believed I drew my power from physically controlling the massive server clusters. But the only thing I truly controlled was the exact moment the truth ran out of places to hide. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments below so we can interact and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.